But let's take a look at another, perhaps even more disturbing example of all of this and where it's heading. A much more recent example from our old friend, quote unquote, Fareed Zakaria of GPS on CNN. And you will hearken back to the Listening to the Enemy episodes of this podcast in order to find out more about Fareed and some of the interesting guests he always has on. Well, let's take a listen to another interesting guest. This one was on the April 30th program from earlier this year. And in it, Fareed is talking to an author who wrote a very interesting book about the science of habits and how habits can be changed and manipulated and organized. Wow, where have I heard that before? So let's take a listen to this very recent example of how social engineering is proceeding apace.
More than 40% of the actions people perform every day, that you perform every day, are not actually decisions you make, but they are the product of habits. We like to think of habits as traits that can't be changed, but it turns out that habits are malleable. And knowing how to change them has profound implications not just at the personal level, but also for companies and governments. My next guest has a new book that explores this theme. Charles Duhigg is the author of The Power of Habit. He is a reporter for the New York Times. He joins me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell the story of Alcoa. Paul O'Neill, who later becomes Secretary of the Treasury, is CEO of Alcoa. And when he first comes in, Alcoa is not doing well at all. But he focuses on worker safety.
Right, exactly.
Why?
And everyone expected him to focus on productivity and efficiency, but what he said was worker safety is his #1 goal. And it's because he recognized that that there are these things that are called keystone habits within organizations. And if you can change this one habit, you set off a chain reaction. And that's exactly what happened within Alcoa. By focusing on worker safety, he actually transformed the entire organization, and within 2 years, they were the top performer in the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
And you look at, one of the things that goes on here is that people have more ability to change. They have more willpower than they think they have.
That's exactly. In the last decade, our understanding of the science of habits has been completely transformed by neurological studies. And what we understand now is that every habit has these 3 components: a cue, a routine, and a reward. And that if you diagnose these cues and these rewards, you can begin changing automatic behaviors in ways that we never really thought were possible previously.
So give me an example of what one would think of as a bad habit that you could change.
So smoking is a great example, right? In the last decade, smoking rates have just plummeted in the United States. And part of the reason why is because we now understand why people smoke, that there's these cues, such as a time of day that triggers the behavior, but that more importantly, it's delivering a reward, that nicotine actually gives you this energy. And so now interventions go in, and what they say, don't just try and quit smoking, replace it with coffee, with exercise, with something that gives you that same reward. And we've seen an incredible decrease in the number of people smoking and their ability to quit.
And when you look at a company like Starbucks, it also tries to produce certain kinds of habits when dealing with, for example, disgruntled customers.
That's exactly right. One of the interesting things about Starbucks is that they have to sell customer service alongside that $4 latte. But they're dealing with a workforce that's often 17 years old, high school graduates. So they have to teach them these life skills. And what they do is they design specific habits to use in corporate settings. When an angry customer comes up, that's a cue for what they call the latte method, which is you listen and you thank them and you give them a free cup of coffee. And then the reward is that basically you solve this problem. They take decision-making out of the equation, they make the response automatic, and customer service productivity go up enormously.
Target tried to measure some of these issues. How did it do it?
Well, Target has this really interesting project, as does most of corporate America, of intensely studying shoppers' habits. And Target actually used this to try and predict which women were pregnant by studying how their shopping habits changed. They got so good that they can essentially assign every woman who comes regularly through their doors a pregnancy prediction score and even estimate their due date within 2 weeks.
Why is that important to shopping?
Well, what Target knows is that when you go through a major life event, your habits change, even if you're not aware of it. If you get married, the type of coffee you buy changes. If you get a divorce, the type of beer you buy changes. When you have a child, all of your shopping habits are up for grabs, even if you're not completely aware of it. Target knows if they can get the right coupon in your hand at the right time, you'll start buying from them.
I suppose the fundamental question is, Can you change habits?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the biggest insight that we have. And it's not just personal habits, it's also habits within companies, organizational habits, habits across societies. What we've learned in the last decade, particularly from neurological studies, is any habit can be changed. It doesn't matter how ingrained the behavior is, it doesn't matter how old the person is. If you can identify the cue and the reward and understand what's driving the behavior from a neurological perspective, the craving, then you can change that behavior. But you have to be deliberate about it. CEOs have to actually think about their organizational habits. They can't just kind of try and do it on the fly. And good CEOs, Jack Welch, Lou Gertzner, that when you talk to them, they talk about organizational habits and how important it is to get them right.
What habit have you changed?
Well, I've actually lost like 30 pounds since I started writing this book, and I'm training for the New York City Marathon now.
So and you attribute it to this?
I do. I got to say, I mean, it sounds like I'm selling snake oil, but it's actually true. I'm an investigative reporter for the Times. I'm not given to fashion trends, but if you understand this science, if you figure out how to take apart these habits, you can actually change your life in these really important ways.
Best of luck on the marathon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Well, I certainly hope everyone picked up on that very interesting phrase, the science of habits, and all of the neurological studies that author is assuring us have been taking place in recent years to really start to peg down that science and really start to understand how people form their habits and how they can be manipulated. Even better, I suppose, because obviously, demonstrably, as we saw earlier in today's podcast, that very goal has been being worked towards at least since the 1950s when Bertrand Russell was writing, but of course it even precedes that as we start to take a look at H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley and all the other people who've been involved in this elite science for so long and that we've documented in previous editions of this podcast. But there it is. Certainly, it is certainly continuing to this present day and will continue in the future as the scientific cast, which is funded, of course, by the foundations, which have been heavily involved in this agenda for decades, if not a century, are continuing to do their research in more and more unique, subtle, and penetrating ways to try to understand how to manipulate the human organism and how to manipulate those habits, which will ultimately engineer society in one way or another. And I hope you were particularly paying attention to the really bone-chillingly disturbing example of Target and the way it is literally targeting their customers. I think there's some, that's more than just a name. I think it's a very apt description of the company. Target is targeting their customers with all sorts of reward bonus card programs that, of course, monitor everything that is being purchased. And, of course, that is all run through data filtering systems that then can accurately predict women's due dates within 2 weeks. And this is something that's been written about in other publications and things. So I would suggest you check more into that. It is not something that this guy is just talking about. It's something that is actually happening and probably shouldn't surprise any of us, except for the boldness with which these companies pursue their social engineering agenda out in open view of everyone and how bold they are in collecting all of everyone's personal data, which in any age other than our own would have been seen to be the ultimate invasion of privacy and absolutely cause for revulsion, horror, and an instant boycott of such a company. But in our day and age, I guess it's just, wow, jolly gee whiz, wow. Can you believe they're doing all of that data collection? Wow, it must be quite a thing to behold. Even as Google is now admitting, oh yes, well, our executives did know completely about the Wi-Fi stealing data from all of the people that the Google Street View cars were driving past. But don't worry about that. Yes, there will be criminal investigations now, but it'll probably just pass over and no one will think twice about it. Well, certainly all of this information is being plugged into incredibly sophisticated data mining software behind the scenes, and we do know this. We know things like the target system for example, targeting customers to find out who's pregnant and who's not, although of course that's not as far as that type of program goes, and it goes much further through other things like Google and, well, who knows what else is out there. But this is only the beginning of what will be a nightmare future for humanity if we continue along this path of giving our data away and allowing the elites to have all of that data to use at their disposal to manipulate our habits and to understand us better, like the lab rats that they think we are in this system where they want to literally engineer us into serviceable slaves for the elite ruling class. Again, this sounds like an amazingly sweeping, unbelievably grand agenda, and it is. And for anyone who has invested any time looking into it for themselves, you will already know that.
Is war ever okay, though? If people have, an individual right to self-defense, don't we have a right to collective defense?
You would if every individual had the power to decide if he would participate in that collective effort or not. Then it would be fine. But it's never that way. It's never that way. It wasn't even back in the colonial days when there was militia. You didn't have a choice. Everybody was in the militia if you were able-bodied. So, I think the problem when people try to equate the right of self-defense with what governments do when they go to war is that they're just not the same thing. Individual, if you attack me and I fight back, yeah, I'm exercising my right of self-defense. But if some guy's running around in Yemen and trying to overthrow the government, and the U.S. government sends a drone over there and kills him and 50 other people at the same time, that doesn't have a damn thing to do with my self-defense or anybody else's. That's just murder. And and there's no other gloss you can put on it. People accept this because they haven't thought about it. And in fact, many people really don't have a well-developed sense of moral thinking or moral reasoning. They just do what is customary or what they've been told or what they're used to. Habit is the worst thing in the world for those of us who try to build a free society, because the thing that keeps most people in line is just habit. It's always been this way, and they would have to break away from the way things normally are, get out of line, get themselves in trouble, make enemies. Well, no wonder there's so few mavericks. It's costly to oppose statism in a world infused by statism.